Moscow's worst nightmare is truly the existence of a Ukrainian state, and its absolute nightmare is, in fact, the existence of two Ukrainian states. And such a thing could have happened and should happen in the future. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was effectively caught in the pincers of two Ukraines. In the west, there was the Ukrainian People's Republic, and on the Pacific coast, the Far Eastern Ukrainian Republic was formed.
At one time, the vast lands in the Russian Far East were called New Ukraine, Green Ukraine, Far Eastern Ukraine, or most often, Zeleny-Klein, the Green Wedge.
The Ukrainian Far Eastern state receives unfairly little attention. Yet it actually lasted even longer than the Ukrainian People's Republic. Naturally, the question arises, how did so many Ukrainians end up in the Far East that they could create a national state? It all comes down to the greed and treachery of the imperial regime. In 1861, serfdom was abolished in Russia, but there was a catch. The peasants were granted freedom, but they were not given any land. All the plots remained the property of the landowners. So in reality, people still had to keep working for someone else. People got used to comforting themselves with, hope I'll get an education, I'll find a job, but the job you'd find would just be working for the same old boss, damn it, with the same result. Ukrainians are an enterprising people, so they took advantage of their right to move freely and began settling the empty lands of the UnderEmpire. As a result, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, hundreds of thousands of ethnic Ukrainians moved to the Far East, becoming the titular nation in the region. "70% of all settlers in Primorye were Ukrainians. Ukrainians essentially colonized the region. In 1905, after the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, the Tsarist government began to encourage the resettlement of Ukrainians to the east even more strongly in order to create a living shield against the so-called Yellow Peril. We all know what that means. Even back then, there was already fear of Chinese and Japanese expansion. As a result, over the course of a few years, another 1.5 million Ukrainians moved to the Far East. This is how the famous Zeleny-Klein or Green Ukraine came to be.
At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Ukrainians were the most numerous ethnic group in Zeleny-Klein. Thousands of kilometers away from the banks of the Dnieper, they still felt a connection to Ukraine.
Green Ukraine covered an area of 1 million square kilometers, from the Amur River to the Pacific Ocean. That's almost twice the size of modern-day Ukraine. It included the Amur region, Khabarovsk and Primorsky Krais. The Ukrainians didn't just relocate, they literally brought Ukraine with them. But interestingly, this did not lead to conflicts with the local population. The Ukrainian colonists established friendly relations with all the local peoples. There was not a single conflict. You can compare this to how Russians behave in new territories.
The Russian state is guilty of many sins. Of one crime in particular, a crime against all of humanity. I want to speak about the crimes committed against my people. In 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it used its non-Slavic citizens as expendable material. The highest number of casualties in the initial period came from the republics of Tula and Buryatia. All of this is happening against the backdrop of an ongoing assault on our language. It is being systematically removed from schools. There is no study of our literature. History glorifies colonization.
After the fall of the Russian Empire in 1917, the Ukrainians of Zeleny-Klein declared the creation of the Ukrainian Far Eastern Republic, with its capital in Nikolsk-Ussuriysky. This happened a week before the adoption of the first universal of the Ukrainian People's Republic.
On June 23, 1917, the Central Rada adopted the first universal, a document that proclaimed the autonomy of the Ukrainian People's Republic.
At the All-Ukrainian Congress of Green Ukraine, the borders of the new state were established and the formation of the regional council began. The new government immediately funded the opening of Ukrainian schools and the publication of 4 Ukrainian-language newspapers.
Say the word palyanitsa.
Polyanitsia.
Yeah, nice one. Say palyanitsa.
Polyanitsia.
Polyanitsa. Say the word palyanitsa.
Palyanitsia, the armpit, and the famous Russian warship.
The ideologist behind the separation of the Far East from Russia was a local activist, Yuri Lushko. He even managed to create the National Armed Forces of the Far Eastern Ukrainian Republic. Kolchak, who declared himself the supreme ruler of Russia, did not dare to enter into a military conflict with the Green Wedge. Instead, he used the Ukrainians in the fight against the Reds.
I promise and swear to serve him.
So, at the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was squeezed between two Ukraines. Tov mine, mine. Unfortunately, both the Ukrainian People's Republic and the Green Wedge were defeated in the war against the Red Plague and ended up in the prison of nations for 70 years. But the absence of statehood does not mean the absence of self-identity and self-respect. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine gained independence. But for greenukraine, it was more difficult because it was part of the Russian Federation, and over many years, the population of the Green Wedge was Russified.
And Ukrainian compared to Russian? Well, it's just that even here you can really see that the jaws are actually truly quite different. Like us, I can't even speak Ukrainian. My bones are probably arranged differently here.
In 70 years, the number of Ukrainians in the Far East became sharply lower than the number of Russians. If there's one thing Russia knows how to do, it's destroy peoples. It would be better if they learned how to assemble washing machines and perfected the Zhiguli. But instead, all resources and skills are thrown into genocide and war.
Hey there, guys! Hello, Gina! Hello, Ulan Uday, Gina, Yastagors, Higgins, Kushosh!
Even under such conditions, in 1993, the 5th General Ukrainian and Far Eastern Congress was held in Vladivostok. At that Congress, they announced the restoration of satirically. A message was sent to Yeltsin demanding that he recognize the new union. But the most hard-drinking liberal in the so-called history of Russia naturally refused. Ukrainians shaped the culture and society of the Far East. Their enterprise, self-organization, and complete lack of reverence for authority and officials.
Here it is, the material, that's it!
The mentality of the Far East residents became a huge problem for the Kremlin. Putin's regime, used to having serfs on their knees who patiently freeze in barracks while waiting for the direct line with the radiant leader, somewhat failed to take into account the unique traits of the people from Primorye specifically, the fact that deep down they have a Ukrainian core. Putin removed the Khabarovsk governor Furgal from office and then had him arrested.
Governor of Khabarovsk Krai Sergei Furgal was detained.
In any other region of Russia, this event would be completely ordinary and wouldn't raise any questions. But not in the Green Wedge.
In Khabarovsk, thousands of people peacefully marched in support of the arrested governor of Khabarovsk Krai Sergei Furgal. This is the largest protest in the city's history.
Furgal was not an appointed governor, but an elected one. The majority of Khabarovsk Krai residents voted for him. And he won the election against the United Russia Party's candidate. That's why people came out to defend him, or more precisely, to defend their own choice. And the slogans at the protests were quite bold. Moscow, go away!
We elected him, and we should be the ones to judge him. We support him. Why was he taken to Moscow?
The residents of Khabarovsk Krai essentially declared their desire to separate from Russia. They were supported by other regions of the Far East and Siberia as well. Rallies in support of the people of Khabarovsk took place in Vladivostok and Yekaterinburg. The protests lasted for half a year, and tens of thousands of people took part in them. Moscow managed to disperse the protesters by force, but it failed to extinguish the protest. With varying intensity, it continued for another 3 years.
What on earth is this? They've absolutely lost their minds.
The Far East must be truly and completely free from the influence and control of Moscow. There are absolutely all the necessary prerequisites for this. Social, economic, and historical factors. Now is the perfect, most opportune moment to finally and decisively tear apart the pseudo-empire, like an old, battered accordion at the funeral of the Kremlin's mother-in-law. On one side Ukraine, and on the other a new, independent Far Eastern state, ready to stand on its own 2 feet.
I would like to remind you that this video is created for entertainment purposes and contains elements of satire and irony. All facts and events are presented in a hyperbolized or exaggerated form to convey a comedic or dramatic effect. Our goal is not to mislead, but to highlight humor. Please take it with a smile.